some quotes on the PowerPoint to save time, I hope. And now we will move from revolutionary time to anti-revolutionary time, you could say. There is no doubt that utopianism is a fundamental element of futurist discourse throughout the movement's history. This is true, of course, because of the underlying faith in the power of art to reinvent and recreate all aspects of not only artistic but also practical life, but also because Futurism often imagined the future not so much in positive terms but in negative ones, as what it is not, in other words, as utopia in its most literal sense, as a non-place. Of course, from their earliest manifestos, the Futurists had much to say about the proper subjects of Futurist art, machines, factories, crowds, etc. But these objects often seemed to be abstracted from a context and to be merely the momentary embodiment of grander ahistorical forces, dynamism, energy, speed. When modernity is imagined, it is imagined in the terms of Nietzsche's critique of historical thinking in his second Untimely Meditation. That is, as a rejection not so much of a historical tradition, but of history and tradition as such. Indeed, Marinetti's conception of modernity could be summarized in the terms of Paul de Man's famous commentary on Nietzsche's texts that you can read here on the PowerPoint. In Marinetti's theory and practice, Futurism is a project to learn how to dwell on the threshold, to carry out the difficult balancing act involved in evading history while at the same time carrying out the production of cultural artifacts which inevitably exist upon the historical plane. However, it is if upon its foundation Futurism, at least in Italy, had few rivals in its attempt to stake out the territory of modernity and to define it in its own terms, in the period between the two world wars, it found itself in increasing competition with other social and cultural movements. First among them fascism. In this paper, we are interested in considering how Futurism found itself in conflict with another powerful institution, the Catholic Church, on precisely these grounds. Since its foundation, the Futurist movement had found one of its political pillars in anti-clericalism, its fierce attacks against the Catholic Church being motivated both by its hostility for any institution steeped in tradition and by the anti-nationalist agenda of the Church, which refused to recognize the authority of the Italian state after the end of its temporal power in 1871. In this paper, which is part of a larger project on the relationship between literary modernism and religion in Italy, we will consider how the late 1920s and in the 1930s, the debate on sacred art and the growing interest of the futurists on the subject, in part because of the lucrative contracts that such artistic production might entail, forced the movement to confront alternative versions of modernity and to redefine its own. Ernest Yalongo has recently observed that the Manifesto of Sacred Art was timely released in May 1931, immediately after Mussolini had shuttered Azione Cattolica, the Catholic youth movement that competed with fascist organization in organizing youth activities. For Yalongo, this manifesto was part of Marinetti's strategy to work towards Mussolini and confirms that Marinetti was a fervent fascist. Anti-clericalist in Yalongo's reading means first of all anti-Vatican. He writes, and you can read the complete quote on the PowerPoint, after the Lateran Accords there was more than enough room within Futurism for an arte sacra, as loyalty to the state was no longer divided. The first sentence of the manifesto, "It is not indispensable to practice the Catholic religion in order to create great works of sacred art," signals therefore, in Jalongo's view, Marinetti's intention to bypass the Vatican, just as it was Mussolini's goal to reduce the autonomy of the Vatican intermediary. If Jalongo's argument finds legitimacy in the question of timing, when manifestos were released in relation to the broader political context, maybe the other parties involved in the struggle for hegemony also have to be heard, the Catholic Church and its cultural representatives in the first place. Indeed, following the signing of the Lateran Accords in February 1929 was a time of particular excitement and enthusiasm among Catholics, as Manacorda has written. 3 months later, Piero Bargellini founded the Catholic literary journal Il Frontespizio, a follow-up of his Il Calendario. The first issue of Arte Sacra, rivista trimestrale dell'arte sacra di oggi e di domani, one of the most polemical voices in the modernist drift of sacred art, was published on 30 September 1931, and it had the unconditional support of both fascist and Catholic institutions, the Fascist Federation of Artisans, the Holy Congregations of Rome, and the Italian Council of Bishops. According to a note published in 1933 in the Annali dell'Italia Cattolica, Arte Sacra followed a policy of free expression and open discussion, without the expectation of imposing any particular artistic school or direction, although within limits that must not be crossed in order not to slip into artistic modernism. For Catholic Italy, it is clear who dictates the law for sacred art, the Pope himself, with the fascist authorities on his side. Not only did the journal publish an editorial, Sull'arte sacra futura, by Giovanni Battista Montini, who was the future Paul VI in its first issue, but it also reproduced Pope Pius XI's speech on the occasion of the opening of the Pinacoteca Vaticana on 28 October 1932, commenting that his words lay down the law. And the journal gives the Pope their unconditional support. With the support of the Pope's indictment on modernism, the Futurists' wish to be at the avant-garde of sacred art is countered with every means and argument. Sacred art and its alleged crisis is such a fiercely debated topic that Arte Sacra also dedicated a referendum to it in 1932-33, the outcomes of which were followed closely by the Annali. Before entering the discussion, we want to have another close look at the Manifesto of Sacred Art, that was first published to coincide with the 1931 exhibit of sacred art in Padua, where the Futurists were present with a small delegation. If it is true, as Jalongo argues, that anti-clericalism is no longer at stake once the pacts between state and church are signed, why would the Futurists need to reassert their anti-clericalism in the Manifesto of Sacred Art, where they describe the movement as firmly anti-Masonic and anti-clerical? And why would there be the need to re-emphasize Futurism's novelty and to summarize its outcomes, if there is enough room for the movement to occupy the field? It is our impression that Futurism's anti-clericalism and anti-traditionalism are repeated to address other factions within the broad modernist movement, such as the Novecento movement that also aspired to the unofficial role of fascist art, as much as they are meant to trigger the attention of the church and of the regime. At a time the movement's modernity is under attack, it feels the need to underscore its premises once again. In the Manifesto of Futurist Cuisine, that you can see on the PowerPoint, It is said that, and I will only read a little part, contrary to established practice, therefore, we futurists disregard the example and cautiousness of tradition so that at all costs we can invent something new, even though it may be judged by all as madness. The suggestion is that futurist battle cries stay unaltered, as the movement puts itself ahead of innovative change and in conflict with tradition. What's more, Futurism possesses not only the practical but also the spiritual values necessary for future renewal, even in this case of sacred art. And this becomes clear in points 4 and 5 of the Arte Sacra Manifesto. Only futurists are able to endow the painting with the power of magical surprise necessary for expressing the miraculous, and 5. Only futurist artists are able to express clearly the simultaneous dogmas of Catholic faith. It is possible to link these predictions of challenges yet to come with Futurism's vision on utopia and revolution, carried out by means of the virtues of heroism, genius, inequality, and facilitated by the conquests of speed, electricity, and machines. A quote from The Necessity and Beauty of Violence clearly states how these modern values are at odds with tradition. We believe that only a love of danger and heroism can purify and regenerate our nation. According to the Arte Sacra Manifesto, the futurist aero painters are most able to capture the transparency of infinite beatitude, the velocity of angels and the apparition of saints, and the use of electric light is recommended to decorate churches. It is curious to see how in the Annali one can even find directions of the Vatican on how electric light in churches should be properly used. First of all, no scenographic use of light, electric light. To reformulate generalizing concepts from within seems also to be a constitutive element of the movement, and this could be another aesthetic argument in support of Yalongo's thesis that Marinetti's chameleontic changes are not just inspired by opportunism. In the essay, Old Ideas That Go Hand in Glove But Need to Be Separated, the traditional concepts of democracy, progressive and nation conservative are remolded to fit with a vitalist militarist vision of politics. What all these elements have in common is that they are anti-Catholic, as is declared in another crucial 1919 manifesto, against the papacy and the Catholic mentality, repositories of every kind of traditionalism that you find on the PowerPoint. All these glories of ours are anti-Catholic in spirit. Inherent to the futurist program is the principle that everything in the end is a work of art. Thanks to us, a time will come in which life will not be simply a matter of bread and toil, nor of idle existence, but a work of art. In this light, the essay Beyond Communism, written by Marinetti in 1919 in the San Vittore prison in Milan, may be one of the futurist leaders' most spiritual manifestos, therefore relevant for our argument here. The desire is affirmed once again to liberate Italy from the papacy, and the nation is exalted in a wording that could be used for religious faith as well. However, the futurist revolution that will bring artists to power promises no earthly paradise. It will certainly not be able to suppress human torment, but will resolve the problem of well-being in the only way possible, which is spiritually. Futurism can only operate when it acts from the present. All universal concepts have to be related to the particular individuality of the nation of Italy. How is futurist modernity debated by the voice of a Catholic culture in the making? As was pointed out on the pages of the Annali, when it comes to modern sacred art, we are at the very beginning. Let us therefore consider the referendum started by Arte Sacra on the first issue of 1932 and strengthened halfway by the holy word of the Pope. This intervention dispenses the editorial board from discussing those answers that we have received or that we might have received that are in conflict with the pontiff's dictate. The Pope's verdict figures in the 1933 issue as an epigraph in the journal and is condensed to the following sentences. We are in favor of modern art. We heartily welcome and open all doors to any good and advanced development of our good and venerable traditions. The new is not true progress unless it is as beautiful and good as the ancient. On 15 May 1932, the journal Futurismo, which had not been officially invited to provide an answer to the Arte Sacra survey, did so on its own pages, which are reprinted on Arte Sacra. The answer to the second question of the referendum, what in your opinion is the current state of Italian sacred art, is there a crisis, was a classical example of futurist self-assertion. In the present there is no sacred art other than that of the futurists, who even in this field are forerunners, and through whom is blooming again a sacred art for our time and worthy of God. The third question, are you willing to contribute to the rebirth of sacred art and how? What works would you prefer to do for this goal? Is misread in order to open a polemic with the former futurist painter Ardengo Soffici, who was invited instead by Arte Sacra to answer to the referendum. Not only we are not willing to contribute to the rebirth of sacred art, but we have already been doing so for the past 4 years, in complete opposition to Ardengo Soffici's answer to Arte Sacra. These querulous words are preceded by Arte Sacra's editorial comment in Avio alle risposte, in which the journal clearly distanced itself from what it considered futurist blasphemy and invited the clergy to take measures against it if necessary. We don't deny the contribution that they made and will make to art. What we do not like is their tone as well as very often their absolute mediocrity aside from their tone. We only wish to invite those clergymen who might be reading this to consider one thing. It would seem to us to be a form of sacrilege to talk about things that have to do with the worship of God for the mere sake of writing and talking. If words are not to be followed by actions, it would be best to talk about something else and not to take once again God's name and glory in vain. Indeed, Annali provided a counterpoint to this critique of the futurists by emphasizing the answers of their former fellow travelers Soffici and Papini, whose responses even informed the journal's own official position. Giuseppe De Mori, in an article on sacred art after the speech of the Pope, suggests that maybe art in general is in crisis, but that this crisis is felt more urgently in religious art, because the autonomy of art and spirit is felt more clearly and is strikingly in religious art, and its results are more harmful. In a following 1935 overview of the arts by De Mori, Soffici is said to react aggressively when reminded of his futurist past, and it is again Soffici who leads the way on how tradition should be intended. Tradition, which does not consist in transitory forms, modes and appearances, but in the spirit, the essence of profound coherence that inspires the soul of a people, of a race, in the ascending movement of its history, understood as a totality of civic human expression. Tradition is placed against modernism, but not against modernity. This important distinction is made by Giovan Battista Montini in his Sull'arte sacra futura, which opens with the following statement that you can read here. And he makes a distinction between modernity and modernism, of which he rejects the latter and promotes the former. From these definitions and comments, one can start to deduce what's wrong with Futurism's proposal for sacred art. First of all, the manifesto starts in the wrong way when it argues that it was no essential to practice the Catholic religion in order to create masterpieces of religious art. The more he quotes at length from an article by Marciano Bernardi that appeared on La Stampa in November 1932. Bernardi asks himself if expressions of modern art such as Futurism that take form and genius as their essence are to be considered fatal errors, and he gives the following answer. An aesthetic movement is never an error, if nothing else, because no one can impose it. It is a spiritual necessity. From this premise derives that, secondly, artistic movements cannot be directed by men, but only by the spirit of the time that is necessarily directed towards God. The guiding principle cannot be the work of art itself, or worse, art for art's sake, but should rather be God, or in other words, moral truth. Another essay on Anali, written by Giuseppe Molteni and entitled Lo pseudo-misticismo in arte e in letteratura, quotes Pope Pius XI's encyclical Castico Nubi. Pius dismisses avant-garde art for art's sake as a nonsense because it offers no answer to the vexata question of the relationship between art and morality. For us Catholics, the problem has been solved. We do not allow art to be placed above morality or to be independent from it. For us, art for art's sake is the formula for an antisocial and anti-moral aesthetic preciousness. The conclusion of the debate on sacred art is that tradition inspires modernity, and not the other way round, and that the past is not surpassed by futurist religion of speed, but rather re-establishes instead a sacral unity of time and space. Or again, in the words of Montini, sacred art is thus freed of any purely formal link with the past, which no longer rises above it, no longer demands mannered imitation, but what only brings it back to the bedrock of tradition and pushes it forward. It invites it towards the new and keeps it within the old. Or in the audacious phrasing of Maurizio Denis, quoted by De Mori in his 1935 survey on the rebirth of sacred art in 1934, as a consequence of the Pope's guiding principles, Catholicism is the avant-garde of the modern movement.